the pattern you can't escape. Freud's theory of repetition. Compulsion. There is a moment, quiet and private, that almost everyone has lived through. A person stands at the edge of a decision, having just survived something painful, a broken relationship, a failed attempt, a humiliation they swore they would never allow again. And in that moment, they make a promise to themselves. Never again. Not like this. Not this way. Months pass, sometimes years. And then, almost without noticing how it happened, they find themselves standing in the same place, the same kind of partner, the same kind of failure, the same disappointment, wearing a slightly different face, but unmistakably, unbearably familiar. They ask themselves the question that so many have asked before. Them, in the dark, in the quiet hours when no one else can hear. Why does this keep happening to me? It is tempting to believe that life is simply unfair, that bad luck follows certain people, that circumstances beyond our control conspire against us again and again. But there is another possibility, one far stranger and far more unsettling. What if some part of us is not merely a victim of these patterns, but their quiet architect? What if something inside the mind is not avoiding the pain at all, but returning to it again and again, on purpose? This was the question that occupied one of history's most controversial thinkers, a man who spent his life staring into the shadowed corners of the human psyche, refusing to look away from what he found there. His name was Sigmund Freud, and one of his strangest, most haunting ideas still echoes through therapy rooms and quiet confessions a century after he first wrote it down. He called it repetition compulsion. By the time Freud arrived at this idea, he had already spent decades building a picture of the mind that unsettled his contemporaries. He proposed that human beings were not the rational, self-directed creatures they believed themselves to be. Beneath the surface of conscious thought, he argued, there existed a vast unconscious territory, filled with desires, memories, and conflicts that the waking mind could not fully see or control. Dreams, slips of the tongue, sudden irrational fears. All of these, Freud believed, were messages rising up from beneath the surface, fragments of a hidden inner life quietly shaping behavior from below. But it was during his later years, while treating soldiers returning from the First World War, that Freud encountered something that troubled even his own theories. These men had lived through unspeakable horror. Logic suggested that their minds would want nothing more than to escape those memories, to move as far from the battlefield as thought could carry them. Instead, Freud observed something disturbing. Many of them returned to the trauma again and again in their dreams, reliving the terror night after night, as though something within them was compelled to walk back into the fire rather than away from it. This did not fit neatly into his earlier theory that the mind is driven primarily by the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain. If that were entirely true, why would anyone's unconscious summon the very horror they were desperate to forget? Freud began to suspect that there was another force at work, a force that did not seek pleasure and did not simply avoid pain either, a force that sought something else entirely, the familiar, even when the familiar was unbearable. He called this the repetition compulsion, and he suggested that it did not only apply to soldiers and trauma. He believed it extended into the ordinary architecture of everyday life, into the choices people make in love, into the way people sabotage their own careers, into the eerie sensation of living the same emotional story on repeat, with different characters standing in for the same old roles. He noticed it, too, in something far smaller and stranger than trauma. In the games children play, a child might throw a toy away over and over, only to demand it be returned to them over and over, seemingly delighting in the very act of loss and recovery. Freud watched this and wondered whether something similar was happening on a much larger, much darker scale in adult life. Perhaps the mind rehearses loss, rehearses pain, not because it enjoys suffering, but because repetition itself offers a strange kind of mastery. Each return to the wound is, in some hidden way, an attempt to finally control what once could not be controlled at all. This was a radical departure from how psychology had understood pain. Until then, the assumption had always been simple: living creatures move toward comfort and away from suffering. But if that were the whole truth, trauma would fade with time and distance, the way a scar softens. Years after the wound has closed, Freud's patients told a different story. Their minds returned to the site of injury again and again, as though pulled by an invisible current, long after any rational explanation for doing so had disappeared. Let us make this idea less abstract, and let us walk into a life where it seems to be playing out in real time. Picture a woman in her early 30s, intelligent, warm, capable of real intimacy when she allows herself to feel it. And yet, when she looks back across her romantic history, she notices something odd. Every significant relationship she has ever had has involved someone emotionally distant, someone who kept one foot out the door, someone who made her work for scraps of affection, who left her waiting by the phone, uncertain, anxious, endlessly hopeful that this time, surely this time, it would finally choose her fully. Each time it ends, she tells herself the same thing. Next time will be different. Next time she will choose someone kind, present, emotionally available. And she means it completely in the moment she says it. And yet, somehow, she keeps finding herself pulled toward the same type of person, not out of foolishness, not because she fails to see the warning signs. In many cases, she sees them clearly, early, and chooses to stay anyway, telling herself this one is different. This one will be the exception. Freud might have looked at a story like this and asked a very different question than the one she is asking herself. Not what is wrong with the men she keeps choosing, but what does this particular kind of unavailability feel like to her? Familiar, perhaps, in a way that reaches back further than any of these relationships, perhaps to a parent who was loving in flashes but absent in the ways that mattered most. A love that had to be earned, chased, never simply given. According to Freud's theory, the unconscious mind does not necessarily seek out what is healthy. It seeks out what is known. And if longing, if uncertainty, if the ache of almost love was the emotional language a person first learned as a child, then that language may continue to feel, on some hidden level, like home, even while it hurts. Perhaps especially because it hurts. Consider another life, a very different shape of the same pattern. A man, talented, ambitious, full of real potential, finds himself on the edge of success again and again, and again and again. Just as the door begins to open, he does something to close it. He argues with a supervisor who has offered him a path forward. He misses a deadline he had every capability of meeting. He quits a promising position just as it begins to demand more of him. Friends and family are baffled. He has the talent. He has the intelligence. Why does he keep undoing his own progress at the exact moment success comes within reach? He himself cannot fully explain it. He tells himself he was bored, that the job wasn't right for him, that the timing was wrong. And each explanation feels true in the moment. But viewed across years, a pattern begins to reveal itself with an almost mathematical precision, striking at the threshold of achievement every single time. Freud's theory suggests a haunting possibility that for some people, failure itself can become the familiar shore they unconsciously navigate back toward. Perhaps success was never modeled for them as something they were meant to hold on to. Perhaps a childhood voice, long buried, once suggested that they did not deserve to rise, or that rising too far meant risking a fall too painful to survive. And so, without ever consciously choosing it, the mind may quietly engineer a return to the shape it already knows. Struggle. Almost. Not quite. There is a third kind of story worth telling here, quieter than the first two, but perhaps even more common. It is the story of family patterns, repeating themselves across generations, almost as if passed down like an inheritance no one asked to receive. A daughter watches her mother endure a marriage marked by silence and neglect, and promises herself she will never allow a man to treat her that way. She grows up, builds a life, and finds, to her own quiet horror, that she has somehow built a marriage that echoes the very one she swore to escape. A son grows up under the weight of a father's temper, promises himself he will be gentler, calmer, different, and years later, in a moment of stress he did not see coming, he hears his father's exact words leave his own mouth, aimed at his own child. These are not failures of willpower. The people living them are often deeply self-aware, deeply committed to breaking the cycle. And yet the cycle persists, almost as though it has a will of its own. Freud would suggest that what is being repeated here is not simply a set of behaviors, observed and copied. It is an entire emotional atmosphere, absorbed so early and so completely that it becomes indistinguishable from normal life itself. We do not always repeat what we were taught. Sometimes we repeat what we breathed, what surrounded us before we had any language to name it, let alone resist it. These stories may sound extraordinary, and yet, if we are honest with ourselves, most of us can recognize a smaller, quieter version of the same phenomenon somewhere in our own lives. The friendships that always end the same way. The arguments with family that follow an identical script year after year, as though everyone involved is reading from a script written decades ago. The promise, whispered privately, this time will be different, followed by the slow, familiar slide back into old behavior. Freud believed that these patterns are not simply bad habits or coincidences. He believed they are messages, written in behavior rather than words, from a part of the mind that never had the chance to fully process something from the past. An unresolved conflict does not disappear simply because time passes. According to Freud, it waits, and it looks quietly for opportunities to replay itself, as if some part of us believes that if we live through it one more time, we might finally get it right. We might finally master what once mastered us. This is important because it reframes the entire phenomenon. Repetition compulsion, in Freud's view, is not simply self-destruction for its own sake. It may be, in a strange and tragic way, an attempt at healing, a wound trying to close itself using the only tools it has ever known, even when those tools only reopen it further. It is worth pausing here to be honest about something. Freud's theories, including this one, were never proven with the kind of scientific rigor we expect from psychology today. He developed his ideas primarily through clinical observation, through listening closely to his patients over years of analysis, not through controlled experiments or large-scale data. Many of his specific claims have been challenged, revised, or abandoned by psychologists in the century since. And yet, something about repetition compulsion has endured because it points toward a truth many people recognize the moment they hear it described, even if they cannot fully explain why. Modern psychology has built upon this soil in different ways. Attachment theory suggests that the emotional bonds we form in early childhood create templates for how we expect love, safety, and connection to feel throughout our lives. Templates that can quietly steer our adult relationships without our conscious awareness. Behavioral psychology points to the simple power of learned habit, the way the brain seeks efficiency by repeating pathways it has used before, even destructive ones. Cognitive psychology speaks of bias, the tendency to notice and recreate situations that confirm what we already believe about ourselves and the world. None of these frameworks require the exact language Freud used, but almost all of them arrive at a strikingly similar destination. That much of human behavior is shaped by forces we do not consciously choose. Echoes of the past reasserting themselves in the present, whether we call them unconscious drives, attachment patterns, or conditioned responses. Perhaps this is why Freud's idea has never fully faded, even as the field around him has evolved past many of his specific claims. He was not necessarily right about every mechanism, but he may have been right about something more fundamental, that the human mind is not simply a rational calculator making fresh decisions in every moment. It is, in part, a keeper of old stories, quietly rewriting the present in the shape of the past. This raises a question that reaches beyond psychology altogether into the older, harder terrain of philosophy. If so much of our behavior is shaped by patterns we did not consciously choose, patterns rooted in childhood, in early wounds, in emotional lessons absorbed before we had the words to understand them, then how much of what we call choice is truly our own? Do we choose our habits? Or, in some quiet and uncomfortable sense, do our habits choose us? First, long before we are old enough to object, there is no easy answer to this. Philosophers have wrestled with the question of free will for centuries, long before Freud gave it a psychological shape. But Freud's contribution was to suggest that freedom, if it exists at all, is not something we are simply born possessing. It may be something we have to earn through the slow, often uncomfortable work of bringing unconscious patterns into conscious awareness. Because there is a difference, Freud believed, between a pattern that controls you unseen and a pattern that you have learned to see clearly. The first one governs your life from the shadows, unquestioned, disguised as simply who you are. The second one, once illuminated, becomes something you can finally begin to choose differently. Not easily, not immediately, but possibly. This is perhaps the quiet promise hidden inside a theory that otherwise seems so bleak. If the mind is capable of unconsciously recreating pain, it may also be capable of consciously interrupting that cycle once it finally understands what it has been doing. And why let us return, for a moment, to where we began. The person standing at the edge of a new beginning, having just lived through the ending of something painful, making the same quiet promise so many have made before. Never again. Not like this. Perhaps the reason that promise so often fails is that it is made entirely in the light of conscious intention, while the pattern itself lives somewhere deeper, somewhere the conscious mind cannot fully reach. Through willpower alone, Freud might suggest that real change does not begin with the promise itself. It begins earlier in the slow, sometimes uncomfortable work of understanding where the pattern came from in the first place, which old wound it is quietly trying to revisit, which unfinished story it is still, after all these years, trying to complete. Perhaps freedom does not arrive the moment life changes on the outside. A new relationship, a new job, a new city, a new beginning, a fresh start on paper. Perhaps freedom begins earlier and more quietly than that. In the moment a person finally recognizes the shape of the pattern they have been living inside, often without knowing it, for years, sometimes for a lifetime. Not the moment the story finally changes, but the moment someone finally sees the story clearly enough to ask why it kept repeating itself in the first place. That recognition, small and private as it may seem, may be the closest thing Freud believed we have to genuine freedom. Not the absence of our past, but the willingness, finally, to turn and look directly at it. If this idea resonated with you, if somewhere in these words you recognized a pattern from your own life, you are not alone, and you are certainly not the first. If you found value in this exploration, consider staying with us here at Aion Sophia. where we continue to walk through the quiet, timeless questions of psychology and philosophy, one idea at a time. A like helps this documentary reach others who may need to hear it. Subscribing and turning on notifications ensures you won't miss the ideas still waiting to be explored. And before you go, we would like to ask you something. Have you ever noticed yourself repeating the same pattern in your own life? A relationship, a habit, a familiar ending you swore would never happen. Again, we invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. Sometimes, simply putting a pattern into words is the first quiet step toward finally breaking it. Because in the end, perhaps we are not so different from the patients Freud once studied, walking in circles we cannot quite see, waiting for the moment we finally do. And when that moment comes, it rarely announces itself with certainty or triumph. It arrives quietly, almost like a memory surfacing from very far away, whispering only this: "You have been here before."